Hello again and welcome back to the channel. In this video we're going to be concluding our look at carbohydrates. We will start with a recap of the introduction to carbohydrates from the last video, and then we'll look at polysaccharides. We will distinguish between two examples of polysaccharides, glycogen and starch. We will then go on to how glycogen and starch are adapted to their function as energy storage molecules. And then we'll conclude by looking at cellulose, how it differs from the other two we've just talked about, glycogen and starch, and how its structure is related to its own specific function as a structural carbohydrate. So let's dig in. So in the last video, we talked about how carbohydrates are primarily made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. We also talked about simple sugars, which are the simplest carbohydrates, and they tend to form monomers of more complex carbohydrates. Another name for simple sugars is monosaccharides. And we looked at some examples of those in beta glucose. In this lesson, we're going to be focusing on polysaccharides. So what are polysaccharides? These are carbohydrates made up of multiple monosaccharides bonded to each other. So we're going to focus mainly on three polysaccharides. We'll start off with glycogen. So what molecules make up glycogen? We have alpha glucose, so let's try that again. So alpha glucose. And what is glycogen used for? It's an energy storage molecule in animals. So it's an energy storage molecule in animals. So what tissues in humans, for instance, store the most glycogen? We would tend to have the most glycogen in muscles and the liver. Okay. And then you've got there a diagram of the structure of glycogen. In the last video, we talked about 1,4 glycosidic bonds, and those form long chains of glucose molecules. But you can also have 1,6 glycosidic bonds, which form branches. So as you can see in the diagram, you've got the 1,4 glycosidic bond labeled there. And then you've got a 1,6 glycosidic bond labeled there. So those form the chains and these form the branches. Okay. So now let's look at starch and relate it back to glycogen. So starch is the energy storage molecule found in plants. So the answer to that first question is plants. And it's made up of two polysaccharides, one called amylose and the other is called amylopectin. I will talk about how those differ from each other in a second. So if you look down at the bottom of that page, you have diagrams of both of them. amylose and amylopectin. So let's look at how they differ from each other. So if you look at amylose, so this molecule, or actually let's use its name. So amylose is made up of alpha glucose molecules held together by 1,4 glycosidic bonds. Now, if you look at amylopectin, which is at the bottom, it has a different structure. So amylopectin is also made up of alpha glucose molecules, but it has both 1,4 and 1,6. 1,4 and 1,6 glycosidic bonds. So it is branched like glycogen. However, unlike glycogen, it has fewer 1,6 glycosidic bonds, so it has fewer branches, and we'll talk more about that later. So starch is insoluble in water because it is a large covalent molecule. So if you do chemistry, you'd know that covalent molecules tend to be insoluble, whereas ionic molecules tend to be soluble in water. Because these are large covalent molecules, they tend to be insoluble, which is going to be something we'll talk about later, but it makes it quite useful for their function as energy storage molecules. So what sorts of features do we need for a good energy storage molecule? So glycogen and starch are good energy storage molecules. Now we need to talk about why. So number one, they are compact. So what's the benefit? It is possible to store large quantities of glucose molecules within them in smaller spaces. So they're more space efficient. So how do glycogen and starch fulfill these characteristics? It's because they're branched. So this is possible because glycogen and starch have branched structures. Okay. Another feature that helps is the fact that they're insoluble. So in the first column, why would that be beneficial? This makes it easier to store the molecules in one place. So in essence, they don't end up dissolving and just going all over the body. They can be kept in a specific area. So how do glycogen and starch fulfill this characteristic? Going back to what I said earlier, this is because they are large covalent molecules. And as I said, covalent molecules tend to be insoluble in water. So think things like lipids like oil. And then let's go on to the last of the main features that make them good as energy storage molecules, the fact that it's easily broken down. So why is this beneficial? It is easier to get back glucose molecules from these structures or carbohydrates. So why is that the case? Because remember from the previous video, we talked about the fact that carbohydrates can be broken down by using hydrolysis. So these molecules are easily broken down using hydrolysis with the aid of enzymes. Okay, so those are the main features that make these molecules good for storing energy. So suggest why glycogen needs to be more compact than starch. So number one, as I said earlier, glycogen is an energy storage molecule usually found in animals, and starch is found in plants. So what's the significance of that? Therefore, animals tend to be more active, generally speaking, than plants, and as such they need to be able to access glucose faster and in larger quantities. So it's helpful that glycogen is more branched and therefore can store more glucose molecules per molecule of glycogen than starch. So animals tend to be more active than plants, so they need a more compact molecule to store more glucose. So by being able to store more glucose, they can basically access greater quantities of glucose for their more active lifestyles than plants can. And then, as I said earlier in this video, we would conclude by looking at cellulose. So what is cellulose? What sorts of organisms have cellulose and what is its function? So number one, animals do not have cellulose. So plants tend to have cellulose. And cellulose is the main component of plant cell walls. So what is cellulose made up of? So unlike glycogen and starch, cellulose is made up of beta glucose rather than alpha glucose. So let's make that a bit neater. So it's made up of beta glucose instead of alpha glucose. So if we have a look down here, we can see the structures of starch, glycogen, and cellulose. As you can see in starch, it's made up of two subunits, amylose and amylopectin. Amylose is a linear chained structure, whereas amylopectin is branched. If you look at glycogen, glycogen is quite similar to amylopectin, but it has a lot more branches. So that makes it more compact and more able to store a greater quantity of glucose. And then finally, you can see that cellulose is really quite different from both of them. Cellulose, on the other hand, is just made up of chains stacked one on top of each other and held together by hydrogen bonds. So if you look there, in between each of these chains, you have hydrogen bonds. And those hydrogen bonds hold the structure together. So how does this enable cellulose to perform its function? Number one, this causes the chains of beta glucose to form stacks on top of each other. So how does that help? This gives cellulose a high tensile strength. What does that mean? It means that it makes it quite difficult to break large molecules of cellulose. It makes it very strong. So if you look at something like a tree in the wind, it doesn't just snap. It actually is able to withstand the forces against it. So it gives a high tensile strength. But also this stacked structure of long chains of covalent molecules makes cellulose insoluble. So this structure also makes cellulose insoluble as a large covalent molecule. Okay, so now let's go on to the next page. And you can see that stacked structure of cellulose more clearly. And you can in fact see where the hydrogen bonds are formed. They're formed between the hydroxyl groups attached to carbon 6 up here. So that's carbon 6. So in between the hydroxyl groups of the carbon 6 of one chain and the OH groups, the carboxyl groups in carbons 6 again and in other carbons of neighboring chains. So you end up with hydrogen bonds in between, and that causes the chains to be attracted to each other, giving a high tensile strength. So how could we benefit from this feature of cellulose? So I told you that plants can benefit from this by having a high tensile strength for their cell walls and for making their cell walls insoluble as well. But we can also benefit from this. This is why wood is a great building material, because it's very strong and it's insoluble. So the features of cellulose, which are desirable for plants, are also ideal for building structures, e.g. large construction work in houses and so on and so forth. So wood is actually a great building material because it's made up of cellulose, which is insoluble, so it's not going to get washed away in the rain. And it's also got a high tensile strength, which makes it ideal for building things out of, so houses and other structures. So that's it on polysaccharides. As usual, it's a good idea to look back at these worksheets and the videos and see if you can keep refilling these until everything sticks. How do you know once you actually do know all of this material, once it's stuck? By being able to fill the worksheets without looking at the videos or looking at previous completed worksheets. Once you can do that, then you know that all of the material is stuck. But it takes time to do that, and you have to keep repeating it in little bits, but often. Okay, so if you found that useful, it would be great if you could click on the like button below. And if you haven't already done so, it would be great if you could subscribe. So hopefully I'll see you in future videos, and I hope that you found this all quite useful. Thanks.